Hi, everybody. I'm Karen MacNeil, author of the Wine Bible and editor of the digital newsletter Wine Speed. And this is our third live virtual tasting in a series on the wines of New York State, which we like to call America's best kept secret. Thank you for being here. If you're returning, we are glad to have you back. And if this is your first time, we're super glad that you're joining us because we're going to have a really great discussion and some delicious wines to taste. And as always, we will take your questions. Let me tell you who's here with me. Emokpae, I got it there. Sorry, she's challenging me already. Is a wine professional based in Philadelphia. She worked in a number of popular New York City restaurants, including Danny Meyer's, Maialino, before moving to Philadelphia to become wine director of Walnut Street Cafe and later Friday, Saturday, Sunday restaurant. She's currently a candidate for the WSET diploma and is a sales representative, for Skurnik, one of the leading importer and distributors in the New York City and East Coast area. Jamie Harrison Rubin is also working in Philadelphia and has been both a general manager and a wine buyer for several Philadelphia restaurants. He's a candidate for the Master Sommelier exam and has a hospitality consulting business called Chef Hospitality. He consults on social media marketing and co-hosts the podcast, You're Gonna Need a Bigger Bottle. Welcome, you two.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah. You know, grapes are grown, of course, have been grown in New York since the time of the 13 colonies. But the industry, let's say, was a little delayed by decades of planting pretty much exclusively either American varieties or hybrids, as opposed to the Vitis vinifera varieties that we are all familiar with for fine wine. And under that Vitis vinifera category, of course, are Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Cabernet, Riesling, pretty much all the wines we drink. I'm wondering so my point is going to be that New York State, while old, is kind of new and in the midst of a bit of a rebirth, as evidenced by wine pros like you both getting really excited by it. So my first question to both of you is, when someone says, you know, why should I drink New York wine? Like, what do you think New York offers to consumers? Eddie, what would you say?
I mean, well, one, I think value is a huge thing, but value also doesn't mean anything if it doesn't taste good. I think the New York State for me is going through a renaissance. I mean, where the wines they've never tasted better. And I think too, for the East Coast, the accessibility of getting up there to actually go and visit and taste the wines is a big thing, where I think, you know, even when I was a buyer or a fledgling, you know, wine person, I think I always thought like, oh man, like I was always looking to the West and being like, I got to go all the way over there to like taste those wines. But here it's like, this is literally in our own backyard. And I, again, like, obviously, we're talking about the Finger Lakes specifically, we're talking about Riesling, but also just the red wines too. I mean, Cab Franc, Syrah, you name it. Everything is getting better and better. But also it's like the price point too is not, it's not going to hurt your bank. So I think that those are the things that I think about for the most part.
That's such an important point. I mean, I'm coming to you from the Napa Valley, where not everything is a steal of a price, that is for sure. Jamie, what would you say?
I would like to echo and emphasize Eddie's point about the wine tasting good. You know, I think first and foremost, when you're thinking about drinking wine from any region, does it taste good? And it's so much about a community of growers who understand how to raise their crop and a community of winemakers who understand how to make the wine. You know, it's nice that it comes in at a price point that's accessible to us. Being friends with some winemakers up there, you know, just wanting to see them succeed, I would not be mad if the prices got a little bit higher, because they need to see a little bit of a return on their investment as well. But I mean, if you're looking for a place that offers a wide variety of styles, Finger Lakes. If you like the Loire Valley, you'll like Finger Lakes.
That's a really important analogy, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, the idea of cool climate and water influenced in the Loire, the giant Loire River, in the Finger Lakes in particular, but also in Hudson Valley. Big bodies of water influencing those vines. You know, I think what you both said is so important to me personally, because when I moved to California from New York many years ago, part of the reason I did is I just wanted to be close to vines, and I wanted to be close to a community of wine people, even if I myself was not a winemaker. So there is something about that, about visiting and feeling that connection, so that wine isn't just something in a store somewhere. You really see its connection to nature and sort of feel it emotionally.
I think community is so key to a wine region's success, just generally speaking. You know, just think about, I think about Willamette Valley a lot when I think about community, because they were so cohesive so early on in the nascent forms of that industry, and that's why it's been so meteorically successful. And perhaps the community in the Finger Lakes has been a little bit more disparate, or maybe not walking in lockstep in the way that that Willamette Valley did. But for sure, they're developing an identity, and for sure, there are a lot of producers that try to lift each other up.
Yeah, nicely said. And when you, as a drinker, feel like you're in on the ground floor, you know, that you're discovering these wines almost a little bit ahead of the curve of where lots of people know it, that's kind of exciting too. I mean, I remember tasting some of the early Willamette Valley wines and feeling like, wow, this is great. I mean, 20 more years, this is going to be such a premier wine region. And New York has that feeling too, that you're uncovering something that not everybody quite knows about yet. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, as Eddie, I think said, one of you said, New York has several wine regions, and 7, I think, to be exact. And we're going to be tasting wines from 2 of them, the famous Finger Lakes, which are a series of deep glacial, cold, deep glacial lakes. Let me get my adjectives in order here. But they are among the coldest lakes in the entire country. And then our third wine that we're going to taste is a Chardonnay from Long Island, again, hugely influenced by the cold Atlantic on both sides of the forks that create Long Island. So before we taste, let's talk a little bit about what cold climate sort of means. Why is, those of us in the wine business, like we toss that phrase around, but what do you think it means to the flavor of a wine?
I think for me, it's really freshness. When you're thinking specifically about white grapes retaining that like acidity, which makes a wine electric and pops in your mouth. And then with reds too, where it just seems like the fruits are like, it's almost, I think of when you taste like a really crisp, cool, like Cab Franc, those kind of like pomegranate flavors, or just like you almost like biting into like fresh fruit. I think it's so appealing. Also, though, wow, usually being lower alcohol, very, very food friendly too. So I think for a lot of people in the wine industry, those wines are the most fun because I feel like they're the most versatile. But those are some of the things that, I think like cool climate means for me.
Yeah. Jamie, jump in here.
I mean, yeah, freshness for sure. I think, if you want to compare apples to apples, talking about like warm climate, Napa Valley versus cool climate, Finger Lakes, talk about, I think Syrah is a really good grape to think about, and think about like Schaefer Relentless Syrah, right? That's a warm climate wine.
That's a warm climate wine. It's big.
It's say something. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't say 16% on the label, but I think, it's hot. And I'm not saying I don't like that wine. I really do like that wine a lot, but it's so much, and you can't have that much of it at a clip. And then think about either Red Newt Cellars Glacial Ridge Syrah, or Element Winery Syrah, both of which are, made with a little stem inclusion, are much less ripe, much more about the sort of bramble character, less about the fruit character. And those wines I could, drink a bottle of and not realize that I had finished the bottle. The Relentless is a little bit of a slog. Once again, really good, like a glass of it with like a steak, but not a great cocktail wine, so to speak. The other thing that I like to think about with cool climate is how variable it is. It's much more variable than a quote unquote warm climate region. People who are working in cool climate really have to contend with a lot of variability vintage to vintage. And we're going to see that because we're tasting 21 up against 20 and those are wildly different years.
Yeah. Let me pick up on something Eddie said. One thing that I always imagine when I think about warm climate, cool climate to warm climate, is if you had a bowl of just picked, almost early picked cherries in a bowl of ice, right? So the cherries are kind of crunchy, just barely ripe. And then you would go to sort of regular cherries, and then you would go to maybe warm cherries, and then you would go to cherries cooking down on the top of a stove, and then you go to pie cherries, and then eventually you'd go to dried cherries, almost like the raisin equivalent, right, of dried cherries. If you can taste that range of cherries, you can taste in your mind, you can taste cold climate to warm climate. It's truly remarkably different in terms of flavor dimension. Without necessarily saying one is better than the other, but radically different in flavor. And I loved that word electricity that you used, Eddie, because I don't know, but like for all three of us, I'm sure this is true. Over time, you taste a lot and you just notice that some wines almost possess an aliveness.
100%.
Like an electrical current running through them.
Yeah, like when you taste like, Mosel Riesling, like, those, even when it has a little bit of RS, like traditional cabinet style, those wines can be some of the most electric ones that you could, ever taste. And like, I don't know, I just think, there's something beautiful about that. Like there's also just texturally too, even from your example of talking about like these different fruits, like something that's crunchy, is vastly different than something that's super ripe and fat. And, I mean, not to say that either are bad, but just like you said, vastly different.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's see. One more question I want to ask the two of you before we start tasting. And we sort of talked about this a little bit among ourselves earlier. And that's the idea that, there is a certain natural chauvinism in an area. When you're in California, you feel like you better be drinking California wine, or maybe one of the great European wines. But it takes a while for Californians anyway to adopt even Riesling from New York State, even when there's no real great Riesling. Sorry, California, I love you, but there's not really very good Riesling. But you both are on the East Coast, and so you probably see a lot more, I don't know, you see the tide turning, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can say specifically in Philadelphia, from being a buyer, there's so much love for New York State wine. One, because it's, about, depending on where you're going, whether it be the Hudson or the Finger Lakes, it's like between a 4 to 6 hour, drive. So that's not really a terrible commute. But there's just so much support. I think the accessibility of getting there, I think the tasting rooms too, I think the warmth of the producers, like the ones that I know personally, and also just I've heard through friends that have worked harvest at certain places. I think, it's where I think when you think about maybe like a California or a Napa, where it's like, obviously it's phenomenal there. I've been once. But there's a little bit of like a, it's different. Like it's more, this like large estates and like a lot of like, pomp and circumstance for some producers that you visit. And where I feel like when going up to visit in the Hudson or in the Finger Lakes, I feel like there isn't that. I mean, and these are, again, still world-class wines, but like that kind of pretense is taken away. And I feel like people get to really know these producers and what they're trying to do. So I think that appeals to a lot of consumers, at least here, that I know in Philadelphia. So it's definitely turning a tide for sure.
Yeah.
James,
you think so?
Yeah. So I think a lot of that touches on, Eddie and I both run in circles that are very concerned with foodways and food systems and consuming local and consuming ethically if possible. And part of doing all of that means interacting with your local environment, like just fundamentally the impact on the environment of a wine that was made 300 miles away from me in the Finger Lakes is much, much less than a wine that was made 3,000 miles away in California or 6,000 miles away in France.
Right.
So there's that. And then, to also touch on what you were saying, another thing that, the circles that we run in are a lot less interested in is the pomp and circumstance surrounding a lot of the great Napa estates. And not to disparage them, they make great wine. And I'm a great supporter of Napa specifically because I think Cabernet Sauvignon is very important and fundamental to our understanding of wine in general. However, a lot of those producers cater to the uber wealthy. Or even just the middle wealthy. And I know for myself, I'm not interested in that market segment. That's an easy way to make money in some ways, but in other ways, I would prefer to taste wine from a producer that has a point of view, as opposed to a producer that's trying to appease a particular palate.
Whoa, very beautifully said, and very philosophically said. And I'm sure that New York does benefit from having that person-to-person intimacy with their consumers, and those consumers feeling philosophically better about the environment, about who they're supporting by, in fact, drinking more locally. Yeah, that will be so helpful for New York, because it's surrounded, of course, by major metropolitan areas. Boston, Philadelphia, New York. Those are logical big markets.
Don't forget about DC.
Yeah.
Don't forget about DC. That's right. Of course, for me, I am going to have to drive 3,000 miles, but okay. I'll have to drink all the expensive Napa cabs for you guys.
Well.
And by the way, that is not to say that there aren't producers with a point of view in Napa. That's part of my interest in Napa. I'm just saying broadly, market segment wise. It's a thing that New York benefits from, not being beholden to the style of the region, while in some ways is detrimental because some people don't know what to expect out of a bottle of Finger Lakes wine. In other ways is to their benefit because creativity can be much more in the forefront.
Okay, well said. Well, let's give these wines a try. The first wine we're going to try has been very important in the modern history of New York State. Let me hold it up. This is the Hermann J. Wiener Riesling from the Finger Lakes. Hermann WIEMER did come from the Mosel, brought that precision, that sensibility of precision with him to the Finger Lakes. Eddie, you are going to kind of lead us off on this wine. Tell us a little bit about it.
So Hermann J. WIEMER. Also, I just want to say congratulations to them again because they're part of the 100 top wine estates for Wine and Spirits magazine for the 12th time. So if that, that's just a taste that speaks to their greatness of the region. But this is coming from the HJW vineyard, which I believe is the first vineyard planted. So these vines were planted in 1977. So older vines here. And this vineyard in particular, where this comes from, it's a much cooler climate here. So, I mean, you're getting low ABV on this wine, but again, just like these really beautiful, like this cool, like really bracing acidity, I think. But also for me though, too, because it's 2020, this was quite a warmer vintage there. I think the fruit pops out a lot more here for me, which is really nice, but.
Yeah. Jamie, jump in on this wine because I know I think you're an admirer of it as well.
Very much. I mean, in my history with the Finger Lakes, this maybe was the second or third winery that I became intimately familiar with. The first was at a restaurant that I worked at in Philadelphia. We had Rubin's Cabernet Franc on the list. And then, moving just a little bit farther south, on the west side of Seneca, you have Hermann J. WIEMER, and I think the wines have been, for the last decade that I've been tasting them, really benchmarkers for what the region can do. They run up and down the sweetness scale. It's been really wonderful watching them convert their vineyards to biodynamics, and to see the effect of that on the wines. And also to an earlier point that I was making, I mean, we're drinking this 2020 vintage, and I was harvesting on the opposite side of the lake in 2020, and everyone in the region was just astounded by the quality that was happening in 2020. Obviously we were all going through a very hard time. Some of us didn't know what our future held. My career fell apart. Luckily we're back to it, but like this was a landmark vintage for the region, and you can taste it in this glass. This is so incredibly expressive.
Because of the pandemic, your career and closing of restaurants and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. It was a wonderful gift, I guess, that nature gave us in the Finger Lakes, that 2020 was such an incredible vintage for both white and red. And this Riesling gives me everything that I want from Riesling. Like it showcases that sort of mineral backbone. And my apologies to Etty because she's heard me say this like a lot, but it also tastes like fruit, which is a thing that I think that we should demand from wine because it's made from fruit. And this is just like so expressive and honeyed and apricot and white peach, and it's just beautiful.
Yeah. When I tasted it, the last time I tasted it a couple of months ago and just now too, it also occurs to me that, I myself even have written kind of a throwaway line citrus, But if you really pay attention, there's like every possible citrus here.
Mhm.
Bergamot, pink grapefruit, kumquat, mandarin oranges. It's just, it's so layered with all those fruit flavors that you feel like your tongue is descending through all these fascinating layers of flavor. It's, I want to, let me pick up on something else you said before I add this other comment, and that is that, yes, Finger Lakes Rieslings, in fact, a lot of New York State wines use what is called the IRF scale, the International Riesling Foundation scale on the back, pointing with a little arrow to whether the wine is sweet, medium dry, or bone dry. I don't see it on the HERMANN WIEMER.
Yeah, I don't believe that they don't use it. I mean, I think it technically does have like a point. I think it's like 0.8, like RS, something like that. But I think I don't think that necessarily matters to them per se. I mean, which I think is honestly the way to go when you're thinking about Riesling. I think it's, it's kind of like what the vintage gives you, you know what I mean? I mean, obviously they make sweeter wines too, but like, yeah, I think I think a lot of people are always concerned with RS so much. It's like, and they'll ask you, it's like, how much RS? It's like, what does it matter? Just taste the wine, because I think of sweetness too. RS, it's all about balance, right? I mean, that's the main thing. Just taste the wine and enjoy the wine, and then maybe we can talk about all those things later. But yeah.
Well, and the funny thing about residual sugar, or RS, as you're giving it abbreviation, is that in a country that questions wine with 0.8% residual sugar, nobody questions cola, which, by the way, has about 11% residual sugar, not 0.8%. Yeah, and as I bet you both would agree, you can never take one number in wine and know anything, right?
Yeah.
You need two numbers, because the acidity in this wine is also off the charts, which is balancing whatever residual sugar it might have. It's only by knowing two numbers that you can come up with any sense of what the wine might be like.
And those numbers don't even tell the whole story, right?
Exactly.
Like if you're looking at the TA versus the RS, the total acidity versus the residual sugar, that tells one part of the story. But then think about pH and like how intensely acidic the wine actually is. You can have a high TA and a relatively high pH, and that has a different textural perception than something that has a very, very low pH as well as a low TA.
Yeah.
And I think that this wine achieves really, really incredible balance. I was going to mention the RS earlier. It reads pretty dry, but it also doesn't read ripping, insane, crazy acidity, right? Like, I can tell that there's a lot of acid in this wine, but the sugar keeps it in check and makes it very, very pleasant to drink.
Yeah. A good analogy for listeners, since we're talking about this, or for viewers, is, if you had a cup of espresso, like really good bitter espresso, and you put a quarter of a teaspoon of sugar in it, that would not make the espresso sweet. It would just round off the edges of the a little bit. So a little bit of residual sugar in a Finger Lakes Riesling often doesn't make the wine sweet at all. It just rounds off the edge of the bite of the acidity. Of course, some of us really love the bite of acidity too, right?
For sure.
Sure, absolutely.
I'm sure all
Acid
three
heads.
of us, yeah.
Yes.
I have been known to indulge in wines that have that like crazy sweet tart, insane acidity.
Yeah. We're getting a lot of wonderful comments from people all over New York, and lots of people saying how much they appreciate farmers, viticulturalists, winemakers, and as Jamie was saying earlier, the community of New York. And Guyan from Ottawa, Canada, is making a few comments about this, and it's reminding me that when you think of Canada, you think cold. Well, the Finger Lakes is almost a baseball's throw from Canada, right?
Mhm.
Is in many ways much of the geology of the Niagara Basin applies to both of those regions, both Ontario, Canada, which also makes some killer Riesling, along with the Finger Lakes. Let's go to the Grüner Veltliner, the WEIS Grüner Veltliner. Let me hold this up so the camera can see it. And actually, this does have the International Riesling scale on the back. I don't know if viewers can see that, but if you buy this WEIS or any number of New York wines, you'll find this on the back, and it's often very helpful. But Jamie, you were going to lead us off on this wine. Your thoughts?
WEIS is on Keuka Lake. Keuka is, I think we all, our entree into the Finger Lakes region is Seneca. Seneca is the deepest. It's the one that never freezes. It has that big convection current, and most of the great producers we think of are there. Keuka, I think, would be next, partly because of Dr. Constantine Frank, which is on the western shore of Keuka. But on the eastern shore, you have WEIS Vineyards, which was started by another native of the Mosel who moved to the Finger Lakes, found a Finger Lakes native to marry, and the two of them started WEIS Vineyards. I think that it's been really wonderful to watch their growth over the time that I have been visiting the Finger Lakes. They started in sort of the area of Hammondsport that they're in, and there have been other wineries that have popped up nearby, and I think that's not a coincidence. I think it's part of the impact that they're making. Domaine Lesueur, right next door, is a favorite of mine, and I think they're doing some really incredible things on Keuka Lake. Yeah,
and this Grüner Veltliner, we should quickly say, is also another logical grape variety that it seems like New York State may eventually become known for. This is the great white grape of Austria, the leading white grape of Austria, along with Riesling. So usually places where Riesling grows well, Grüner Veltliner does too. I want to thank Michael Luby writing in, giving me some geological specificity, saying the Finger Lakes region of New York is actually on what is called the Canadian Shield. So geographically, it's very similar to Southern Ontario. Thank you, Michael, for that. But give me your sense, Jamie, back to you on what you think the potential for Grüner is and how you would evaluate this in terms of its variety. It doesn't have as much pepper. I guess that's where I'm trying to go.
For sure. It is hard to say with Grüner Veltliner. There's not a lot up there. And I've only tasted a few. And as I said, I worked Harvest in 2020, and I worked with a little Grüner at that point. And I've tasted that wine since. It's been finished, and it's really brilliant. I think, a lot of us who have sommelier training, when we think Grüner Veltliner, we think of the Wachau, the most famous growing region in Austria. But the Wachau actually doesn't produce as like the mass market Grüner, the stuff that like gets poured by the glass places. That stuff comes from neighboring Kremstal and Kamptal. Right. And I think that's the style that we can expect from the Finger Lakes currently. The Finger Lakes currently doesn't quite get the level of ripeness that Wachau gets, or at least the sites that Grüner is planted on don't. There are areas of the Finger Lakes that get pretty phenomenal ripeness and a lot of sunshine, but those are largely reserved for reds and Riesling. And so currently we get this sort of light, bright, fresh, easy, citrusy Grüner Veltliner that is exactly what you want on a summer day.
Yeah, and what whenever I see the words Grüner Veltliner on a label, I immediately go looking for sort of white pepper. But what I find in this WEIS is more this fascinating kind of tangy saltiness on the end of the wine. And of course, there is no actual salt in wine, I want to quickly say. But I love that aspect and why some wines have that little kind of zing of salt on the end, because with food, and you both have such long histories in restaurants, you know that that little salty or minerally aspect kind of amplifies the food flavors around it.
Yeah, and I think it's shared by a lot of wines kind of in this category. You know, I think about Comtal and Kremstal Grüner in the same breath as I think about Rias Baixas Albarino. You know, things that have that sort of salinity while still having sort of bright fruit in the background.
Yeah. Harry is asking both of you for a food pairing with this wine. Carrie Weber is asking.
This one's this is just, when I talked earlier about cocktail wine, you know, this is best paired with like some good music on a porch in summertime and friends. But if you really like also crudo, sushi, light seafood dishes.
Yeah, you could do that. Like, I also think too, you can probably go up like fried foods, I think are always great. I mean, I was just in Germany over this summer, so just like schnitzel, I think would be phenomenal with this.
Yep.
You know,
my favorite pairing with Grüner Veltliner, admittedly I haven't had as many New York ones, but is fried chicken.
Yeah, 100%.
So
any like fried is the way to go.
Yeah, fried shrimp, fried spring rolls. Okay, we have to stop right now. We're going to talk ourselves into being starved.
I'm getting dinner right after this, so it's not a problem.
Yeah, right.
Lucky you two. I'm on West Coast time. So our third wine, I'm supposed to start off with. Let me hold it up. It is the WÖLFFER Estate Chardonnay 2021. And WÖLFFER Estate is well known on Long Island. In fact, WÖLFFER makes an amazing 38 different wines, plus ciders, plus spirits. You think, wow, do these guys ever rest? I mean, it's an amazingly productive kind of winery. It was founded in 1988 by Christian WÖLFFER, who was an international businessman and investment banker, today run by his children and by his original winemaker, now a partner, Roman Roth. And they also own a restaurant and stables. I mean, it's a boutique of clothing. It's quite astounding. They also have vineyards on both the South and the North Fork. And if you can imagine like a lobster claw, that's what Long Island is like. The South Side, which is so famous for the Hamptons and well-heeled, well-to-do Manhattanites pretending they're at the beach so that they can wear their, I don't know, $1 million beach outfits, I guess, is not particularly as good for grapes because it's broadside to the Atlantic Ocean. And there can be a lot of storms coming that way. So a lot of the vineyards are more on the North Fork so that they're a little bit more protected, where historically New York's great potato farms were on that North Fork. Anyway, WÖLFFER has vineyards on both near the Hamptons, in Southampton, I think, and then on the North Fork. Let's give it a try. I haven't had this wine in a really long time, so I'm curious. Well, if you like super big, plush, buttery, I don't know that this wine is for you. This is not California Chardonnay, though. No. This has a bit of a spinal column of acidity that's helping to balance its richness. But I agree, a Chardonnay lover would recognize this as Chardonnay. It's not Chablis. It's not green, right? Jamie, what's your take on this wine?
This is the kind of wine, this reminds me of Southern Burgundy of like Macon, Chardonnay. You
Mhm.
know, it's got that signature of what the variety is, but it's not recognizable for sure as what, as you were saying, the buttery Chardonnay drinker would want to drink. This is more the kind of Chardonnay that I love to drink.
Yeah, yeah. And it has that little like, you know, you find your mouth doing that, you know, that it's finishing clean. A friend of mine who is a sommelier says this wine cleans up after itself.
Yeah.
I hope she doesn't say that at table when she's.
That could be like a fun little joke though. I mean, for the right person.
Right.
But yeah, I do like the creaminess on this too. I mean, but again, it's not like overwhelming. But yeah, I haven't had WÖLFFER in quite a while. I mean, used to work with the wines when I worked in New York. So yeah, this is pleasant.
Yeah, I'm much more familiar with the rosé, which I think is their highest production. Cuvée. And I've poured that on and off. The Chardonnay is really nice though.
Yeah.
And as you early on pointed out, Jamie, or no, both of you pointed out, Eddie too, such a value. I mean, I think this wine retails for about $22. So that's, you can't even touch, you know, coastal, cool climate California Chardonnay anywhere close to $22 for the most part.
No, it starts at 40.
Yeah. Multiples of 2. Yes. There's an idea here in all 3 of these wines that New York always reminds me of, and it's the idea of precision. You know, I always used to say to my students, I don't even care what the flavor is, but I want it to be precise. I don't want any, you know, static in the music. I want to hear the music exactly. And that all well-made wines have a precision, whatever they are, and they're not muddled or disparate. If you were to think about flavor as a sound, then their sound is exact. And I'm reminded of that in these 3 wines.
Yeah, I think, you know, you use sound as an analogy. I frequently, when I think about flavor, either think about Venn diagrams or direct lines of flavor. You know, where do these things overlap? You know, when I'm thinking about tastings, a Venn diagram of like the wine and the food. Or with wine, does this travel directly down the center of my tongue? Is there a linearity to the progression of the wine across my palate? You know, the attack, the mid palate, the finish. And I think all 3 of these wines have exactly that.
Yeah. I do like the music analogy a lot. That definitely speaks to me, but I think too, just the idea that, you know, that to make great wine, you don't need a lot of, you know, stuffing, you know, like you don't need to have like a ridiculous amount of oak or things. Not to say that oak isn't used, but I think everything is used like, you know, within measure. It's really about like, what does the wine need? Does it need that? No, then we're not going to do that. And I feel like all these producers definitely ascribe to that philosophy, which I personally think is the best thing, to be listening to the wine, listening to the fruit, listening to the vineyards, and, you know, going from there.
Exactly. Listening to the fruit and listening to the place, and not overlaying it with extraneous winemaking ideas. It has always bothered me when people say, you know, well, we age this wine in new oak to add complexity. And I always think it didn't do that though. That's not what it does. Yeah. Sometimes it's like a down blanket sitting on top of the wine so that you can't even get to the wine underneath.
Right. Yeah. And then who's to say if those flavors will ever merge in the way that they should, and if they do, that's going to take a long time for it to get there. So, you know, yeah.
The winemaker at and owner of Chateau Montelena in California is fond of saying that oak and Chardonnay, oak oak is a little bit like a tattoo. It usually doesn't look that good 30 years later.
Ooh.
No, you got to think that one through a little bit. But,
Interesting.
you both have been absolutely fantastic. I've so enjoyed talking with you about these beautiful New York State wines. Thank you so much.
Likewise, Karen.
Thank you. This was great.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're so glad you did. We hope that perhaps either a WEIMER Riesling, a WEIS Grüner Veltliner, or a WÖLFFER Chardonnay is in your future very soon, although New York is full of really delicious wines that are steals and just waiting for you to uncover the secret of them. So tonight for me, I'm Karen McNeil. Thanks everyone for joining us. Cheers.
Thank you.
Cheers.